Hi, welcome to Exam Revision's Saturday session on Junior Cycle Home Economics with Amy Cowan. Today we're going to be looking at home baking and associated exam questions. This topic will be highly beneficial for both the written exam, but as well for the practical food skills exam, which usually happens in April of third year. Make sure to follow us on our social medias. So we're on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook and YouTube, and we've loads of videos on YouTube for all of our subjects. Have a look and check our past subjects. So today's plan, we're going to look at home baking part 1, 2, 3 and associated exam questions. So home baking part 1, our learning intentions include being able to define home baking, explaining the advantages and disadvantages of home baking, listing ingredients used in home baking, elaborating on the purpose of those ingredients, and distinguishing between the types of flour, which also ties in with the cereals chapter. So first of all, what do you know about home baking? I always get my students to write down what they know beforehand, and at the end of the chapter they come back with a different coloured pen and write it down so you can see how much your learning has progressed. So, home baking. It is essentially when you bake something that is sweet or savoury, so bread and cakes at home instead of purchasing baked goods from a shop. So baking means to cook foods dry in an oven, and essentially that's all they're looking for in the definition. Advantages of home baking. So there's usually a much better flavour because you know exactly what's going into it. It's fresher ingredients. There's very little preservatives used. Attractive appearance. It often looks way better. So if you think of homemade scones as opposed to shop bought ones in a packaging, there ain't no, they do not look nearly as nice. Cheaper, it is much cheaper. Now with the cost of ingredients at the moment, in some cases it can be hard to do home baking at home, but what you should be doing is batch baking and then putting some in the freezer and they'll keep there nicely. So there's no preservatives, so you've no E numbers in it unless you're using one of those like Mr. Kipling bake mixes. You can control the ingredients. So for example, if you're a celiac, which means you are intolerant or cannot digest the protein called gluten, you just use gluten-free flour instead, or you can use rice flour. If for example you're on a low fat diet, you can substitute, so you can recipy or modify the recipe really easily. So disadvantages of home baking. So it can be expensive, especially in some cases. So say for example when you're making your own homemade muesli, if you only want say 100 grams of almonds, but yeah, the pack is 250 grams, are you going to use them all? You're going to have to keep them over for another time. They can be actually quite expensive. You might have to go to like a specialist shop to buy certain ingredients. So if you have poor baking skills, it can be quite hard to follow a recipe, especially when, say, for example, it says do the creaming method instead of telling you that you have to squish your butter and sugar together to create it nice and fluffy. So it can be quite difficult. It is getting a bit more easier with technology in the home, but it's still quite difficult. Lack of equipment. So you may not have a Kenwood food mixer at home and you're going to have to do the creaming method via hand, so you'll have to put the butter and sugar in a bowl and squish it together using the back of a spoon, which can take a lot of time. If you're making pasta from scratch, you don't have a pasta roller, it's going to be particularly hard. Lack of specialist equipment. So say for example if you are making some kind of sweets or caramel, you're going to need a sugar thermometer, because if you go over the specific temperature, you're going to just spoil your baked product. So you can need specialist equipment. Again, I was saying with the pasta maker as well. Takes a lot of time to prepare and bake, and especially if you're an inexperienced baker, it can take a lot longer to set up, and then practicing your washing up skills as well. And then you're waiting for it to cook, which again, when you're cooking it, you're using a lot of electricity, so you need to be aware of that type of stuff as well. It can be quite messy, as many students will know in the home ec room, and it will require a lot of hot water, so you need to make sure that you have access to running hot water and soap, and you need to be able to tidy it up all after you so that you're promoting good food safety and hygiene in the kitchen. Ingredients which are used in baking. So most common ones here, now there's a load more than that, but these are the most common ones that you'd often find. So they'd be your flour, fat, sugar, eggs, fruit, liquid, and raising agent. So we're going to look at these in more detail. So if you were asked to look at ingredients used in baking, you would state, explain, and give an example. So the SEE technique, in this case, your S would refer to state and would be flour. Your explain would be where you're writing down there, usually wheat flour, as it contains gluten, provides structure, and your example would be, for example, be Odlum self-raising flour. Now, you don't have to use Odlums, you can use own brand, it does exactly the same thing. In this case, your state is your fat, and in this case, you're explaining it is keep spread fresh. Butter has the best flavour, margarine is cheaper. This is tying in with the 2023 CBA2, which was looking at how fats and oils contribute to the nutritional and sensory aspect of a baked, sweet, or savoury product. Your example of fat could be butter, could be margarine, it's completely up to you. Your third one is sugar, so you would state sugar and you would explain. So for example, granulated or caster sugar is used for sweetness. Brown sugar kind of adds a spicy flavour, so if you're thinking to gingerbread men, icing sugar is used for decoration. In America they call it powdered sugar because it's really, really thin. Your eggs is your state. You're explaining that it traps air, so it's used for aeration, which makes the product light and airy. If you ever have egg left over and you're cleaning out like a jug and you mix the water with the egg, it will start to form bubbles. So that's what also happens through a chemical reaction, which we will look at later on in this video. Ingredients used in baking, so we have fruit, so these are used to add flavour. They are also used to add texture, so you can use dried, which are sultanas, or you have dried apricots. Now, as they're dried, means that they can contain preservatives to make sure that no microorganisms are going to grow, and also to make them last longer. It also means usually they're preserved via sugar, so there is going to be a higher calorific content than, say, for example, your fresh, like say making blueberry muffins. Your liquid, so this holds all the ingredients together to make a dough or a batter. If you don't have some form of liquid, it's going to just fall apart. So for example, milk, water, egg, you could add in buttermilk as well. There's loads of different liquids. You could add in lactose-free milk. When you're making, for example, scones, if you put too much liquid in, the dough is never going to form. If you don't put enough, it's going to be crumbly and the scones will never stick together with the dough and they're not going to rise properly. So liquid is super important. Next up on our list of ingredients used in baking, we have our raising agent. We look into raising agents in more detail later on in this video. So in this case, we have a substance used to make a gas in a dough or a batter. It causes the dough to rise and become light. So for example, your baking powder. And again, own brand does just as good of a job as the more expensive brands. So next up, we're looking at types of flour commonly used. Again, own brand is just as fine. So here's some examples. So there's cream plain flour, there's self-raising flour, there's strong white flour. So your plain flour will be used in, for example, the likes of your scones. Self-raising flour would be the likes of your cakes and sponge cakes. Strong white flour will be used in the likes of pizza. It is more expensive, but you do have to use it for a pizza base. Coarse wholemeal flour would be, for example, like your wholemeal bread, wholemeal scones. Gluten-free triatomal self-raising flour would be for gluten-free products. The latest thing now, due to COVID, is fortified flour with added vitamin D added into it, and essentially it's just adding a higher nutritional value to the baked good. It is quite a bit more expensive as well. So types of flour. we now know that there's whole grains. So for example, your brown bread, there's your self-raising. So what this does is it contains a raising agent. So for example, it could have, for example, baking powder. So if you're cooking and you don't have self-raising flour, you can get white or plain flour and add in a teaspoon of bicarbonate or baking powder, and that will turn it into self-raising. Now, too much of a raising agent will make it bitter and it won't actually rise. Okay, so too much of a good thing is never good. So back to self-raising flour, example, your sponge cake. Number 3 is your strong flour. So this contains extra gluten. Therefore, it is not to be used in a dish for a celiac, as they are intolerant or cannot digest the protein called gluten. So strong flour is used in yeast cooking. So for example, yeast-based pizza base. Your gluten-free is for celiacs, no gluten, for example, your gluten-free brownies. Your white or plain flour comes from the endosperm, e.g. the scone. So if you look up there at the top left, you will see the cross section of a cereal. So on the outside you have your bran. So this contains the fiber rich layer. So this contains B vitamins and trace minerals. So your wholemeal flour will contain the bran, endosperm and the germ. So the way to remember is BEG, so BEG, starting with B on the outside for bran. In the middle is your endosperm, so this contains your carbohydrates and proteins, and your inside is called the germ, which is your G, and it has lots and lots of nutrients, and this is how the cereal has its nutrient store and allows it to grow. Contains antioxidants which remove free radicals from the body, vitamin E, which is for general good health of the skin, and B vitamins, which are super important for general health and well-being of the body and for energy levels. And of course it would contain saturated fats, but in this case it would be good because if the cereal doesn't contain fats, it's not going to grow properly. This is from a sample paper. Again, it doesn't come up too often, but it could do in the future. So for example, this is tying in again with the food preparation chapter, and most people should be able to get full marks. This would be a typical 8 markers, so 2 marks by 4. The first one would be a weighing scales or a digital scales. You probably also get a measuring scales. The next one would be a jug. And the next one would be, for example, spoons, and then the last ones there would be measuring spoons. So they're slightly different again. So far we have looked at home baking part 1. We're going to now move into the second part of home baking, and then we're going to move on to home baking 3, and the exam questions are intertwined throughout. So in home baking part 2, our learning intentions include defining what a raising agent is, listing the types of 4 raising agents, explaining how raising agents work, discussing the types of raising agents, outlining the importance of oven temperature management, identifying guidelines to follow when baking. So again, write down what you know about baking so far, and then extra can be added at the end. So raising agents. So raising agents are used to aerate baked goods. So aerate coming from the term air, meaning to add air into something. Okay, so it's what causes your baked good to become light and fluffy. And essentially improves the texture. So if you have a cake that's light and fluffy, it's going to be much nicer to eat, as opposed to a cake with a close texture, which means it's going to be quite heavy when you eat it, and you're probably going to need something to drink with it. So this is a definition for a raising agent. So your types of raising agents, the way we remember it is through the acronym ABBY. So ABBY. A for air, B for baking powder, B for bread soda, and Y for yeast. So raising agents essentially add gas to the mixture. In this case, the gas is carbon dioxide, which in scientific terms is called CO2. For the sake of this, we're going to call it CO2. So in the oven, the heat makes the gas. Okay, so it stimulates the production of CO2, which then causes the baked product to start to rise. What happens is a crust is formed on the top, and then it just starts to cause bubbles which push upwards and make the dough rise. Okay, so the heat of the oven forms your crust, which prevents any more rising then. So it'll only rise up to a certain amount. If you put too much of a raising agent, it won't rise. It'll just, eventually just stop. It won't keep going. It'll reach its saturation point, and if you add too little, it's not going to rise that much at all. So to classify raising agents means to put it into a group. So in this case, we have 3 groups. We have natural, chemical, and biological raising agents. So natural raising agents are air. So this is aeration. So this happens into the mixture by, for example, sieving. So when you get a sieve and you hold it up really high, you put your flour in and you hit the side of the sieve, you're producing air, okay, introducing air to it. Aeration, this is called sieving. So when you're rubbing fat into flour, you're adding air. When you're creaming sugar and fat, you're incorporating air. When you're whisking eggs and sugar, really, really high speed, because it's at a higher speed, you're introducing more air, okay? So if you left all of these mixtures out overnight, they would eventually flop down. This would be something that would be important when you're talking about your factors for success in your CBA2 and in your practical culinary skills examination as well. So chemical raising agents. So these are chemical reactions, okay? So home ec does have a slight amount of science within it. In this case, we're looking at the culinary science. There is a chapter called chemical reactions at junior cycle science level, and this ties in really well with it. It also ties in with the acids and bases. So chemical reactions occur between an acid and an alkali. So an alkali is also known as a base. An acid is anything which has a pH of 0 to 6. An alkali is pH from 8 to 14, okay? So when there is a chemical reaction between the acid and the alkali, which are the reactant, it forms a gas, which is called CO2, your carbon dioxide, and this is the product. So when you get, for example, baking powder and you stir in milk, it starts to produce your carbon dioxide. So your baking powder is a mixture of an alkali and an acid. When you add the milk, which is the liquid, your product is going to be carbon dioxide. If you get bread soda and you mix it with buttermilk, it produces carbon dioxide. So in this case, your bread soda is your alkali, your buttermilk is your acid and your liquid, and this produces carbon dioxide. So this is kitchen chemistry, essentially. Your biological raising agent, we're thinking of biological, we're thinking of living organism. In this case, we're looking at yeast. You will look at yeast again in the food safety and hygiene chapter, as it is a microorganism, which means it is microscopic and it is a living thing. So raising agent that makes carbon dioxide in dough. So in the oven, the bubbles of carbon dioxide expand and it pushes up the dough until a crust is formed, and then it won't push up anymore. With yeast, what you do is you have the yeast and you mix it with warm water. If you mix it with a solution of hot water, it will essentially inactivate the yeast, so it won't actually ferment properly. If it's cold water, it won't ferment either. What you have to do is you have to feed the yeast, so you add sugar for it to eat away on, and that's what causes it to ferment, which causes the production of CO2, little bubbles in the dough, and essentially it allows the baked product to rise. So oven temperature. Why is it necessary to preheat? What is preheat? So pre meaning before. So essentially you have to turn on the oven before you put the baked product in, usually about 5 to 10 minutes. Some fancy ovens will have a light that maybe will turn on and tell you when it's reached the desired temperatures. Others won't. You can get a thermometer that specially goes into ovens, so it wouldn't be like a normal thermometer, because this one would reach higher temperatures. So if you don't preheat it and set it to the correct temperature, temperature, your baked product is not going to succeed. So if it's too hot, we all know what's going to happen. The outside is going to burn and the inside is going to be still quite raw. In this case, what you need to do is turn down the oven, and you need to put some tin foil over the baked product, so it will stop the heat rays from penetrating through, but it will still mean that it is cooking because it's hot, but it's not going to burn the outside. If, for example, it is too cool, what happens is the gas is going to escape and the bread or the baked product is not going to rise enough, and your cake is going to flop and potentially right in the center of the cake. And again, with the use of ovens, they are expensive to run. So as soon as you're finished using them, turn them off. Make sure you're using oven gloves so that you are practicing and modeling good food safety in the kitchen. So oven temperature management tips. A lot of this stuff becomes more common knowledge the more you bake at home and in the kitchen in school. So preheat the oven with whatever the recipe requires. So whether it's say 180 degrees Celsius or it's gas mark 6. If a recipe gives a temperature for a conventional oven only, reduce the fan temperature back down to about 20 degrees Celsius. Use the shelf position recommended in the recipe. Not many say that, but usually I'd go for the middle shelf. If you're going for the top, you need to be careful it's not going to burn, especially if you have greaseproof paper, as it can catch fire. And if you put it down the bottom, there's a chance that not enough of the heat will get down there. Next up, in a fan oven, the temperature is the same basically on all of the shelves. Generally in a home ec room, you'd have a 50-50 mix of, your electric ovens and your gas ovens. In a conventional gas oven, the top shelf is the hottest and the lower shelf is cooler, so you need to be aware of that. Never place dishes directly on the bottom of the oven because they won't cook properly. The heat just doesn't get down there, especially when it's a gas or conventional oven. Make sure to cook as many dishes as possible at the same time, so that means you're not wasting electricity. So thinking of Christmas Day, you cook everything at once, and then you keep leftovers for the next day. So what this does is reduce the amount of energy, which therefore is more economical, which is super important, with inflation at the moment. They are oven temperature management tips. This list is not exhaustive, and you could probably come up with a lot more yourself as well. So home baking guidelines. So guidelines are like tips that you should follow. Now again, this list is not exhaustive, and there will be more that you will be able to come up with and that your home ec teacher may have mentioned. So prepare tins and oven shells in advance. If you're preparing the tin and you have the cake mixture ready, what's going to happen is the carbon dioxide is escaping. The longer you're doing this, the less your cake is actually going to rise in the oven. If you forget to put the oven shells in the correct position and it's already preheated, what's going to happen is the metal is going to expand because of the heat, and it's going to be quite hard to move the shells. You're also going to have to do it with oven gloves on. To make sure to preheat your oven, use the freshest ingredients, check expiry dates. Out of date flour is not going to make your cake rise. Your cake is just going to turn out absolutely terrible. Weigh ingredients accurately and follow the recipe carefully. So everyone at some point in their baking career will have weighed something out wrong, and it does affect the overall final texture of the cake or bread. If you don't follow your recipe accurately and you miss a step and you don't know what you're doing, the baked product is not going to succeed either. Sieve to add air. So this is aeration. It is natural form of adding in a raising agent. Add liquids in carefully bit by bit. So when you're making scones, what you do is you cream or you rub in your butter and your flour between your fingers, and then you create like a well in the center, so a hole in the center of the bowl. You add in the liquid carefully, maybe a quarter at a time, stir. Sometimes you may not need all the liquid that's stated in the recipe. Don't add it all in, because if you add too much, you can't take it away, but you can add extra if you don't. If it's too dry, it's easier to add extra afterwards than beforehand. handle as little as possible. So the more you need, for example, your pizza dough or your scones, the more CO2 you're knocking out of it, and the more you're going to affect texture, and it's going to be more leathery, and it's not going to be that appetizing to eat. Avoid opening the oven door like loads of times. Just look through the window, bend down and look through, because what's happening is the heat is escaping, which means that it's not enough aeration is going to occur. Make sure that you have a cool wire tray, or else if you don't have a wire rack, put it on top of maybe the glass part of the hob, because if you're putting it down on, for example, even timber or plastic surfaces, it is going to melt through it. So far we've looked at home baking part 1, we've looked at home baking part 2, we've looked at home baking part, and then we're going to look at home baking part 3, which includes more exam questions. So home baking part 3, these are our learning intentions. So examine how to prepare tins for baking. So this would be particularly important and coming up to the cooking exams. Explain how to check if baked products are done. Again, this would be particularly important. During the cooking exams, listing methods of making baked products. This is something that does come up in past exam questions, and was particularly one of those questions that they used to love to ask in the old curriculum as well. They just haven't asked it as an actual exam in the 2022. Didn't come up in that exam at all, but who knows when it could do. Examine methods of making baked products. We'll be looking in more detail, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of using commercial baking mixes, which is generally quite interesting. So at this stage, you should be writing down what you know, and then in a different colour at the end, coming back to see what you have learned. And it's a visual way of tracking your own learning, and it's very good for, revising back. So tin preparation. So baking trays, these are your flat baking trays. So you can have like circular ones, or you can have ones which are like rectangular. So you can brush it with, say you could put some butter on it and melt it, brush it across with a pastry brush, or you could line it with baking parchment, also known as baking paper, also known as greaseproof paper. You could sprinkle it with flour for breads. However, if you put too much flour on it, it is going to stick to the end of the bread, and it is, going to be stuck to it when the bread comes out, and there will be clumps of flour stuck at the end, so you need to brush those off. Otherwise, it will affect the overall appearance and texture of your baked product. Queen cake tins, so these are like your smaller tins, so you can brush these with oil, or use, in general, like you just use your muffin cases or your bun cases or your cupcake cases. So there'll be bigger ones and smaller ones. Smaller ones starting off would be like your queen cake ones, so your little bun cake ones, moving up in size then to your cupcake ones, and then the bigger ones would be the muffin tins. Cake tins, so you can have circular ones, you can have them of all different sizes. So what you can do is grease the tin with butter. You can also put baking paper around it, and we'll show you in a couple of slides now how to prepare that. So when you're preparing your tin, so you get the circular tin, you get usually the paper, and you put it down on the table. You get a pencil, and the reason you use pencil and not pen is because the pencil works on the greaseproof paper a lot easier, and it's easier to see then when you're cutting out. So you go around it, circle it, cut it out. You then get a strip, and you make sure that it's the height of the actual tin, and you want it to be approximately 2 centimeters higher, so that you can cut little slits into it. And what happens is you put a little bit of butter at the bottom of the circular part of the tin. You insert the disc, and it means that sticks there, or before you stick your your disc in, you would put the layer around it, and you might need to cut that out twice. The bits that you've cut into, you're going to fold down so it kind of sits properly, and then you put your disc on top and it just holds it all in. If there's too much of the baking paper, like if it's far too high according to the height of the tin, you're going to have to cut around it a bit because it can catch fire if you're putting it up the top of the oven. For a square tin, it is essentially the same. You're going to cut it out, you're going to draw it out first of all with a pencil, cut it out so that it's a bit, maybe a centimetre and a half longer in each way. You're going to fold it and you're going to be able to stick it in to make sure that it doesn't move, and that there's not like all wrinkly bits of greaseproof paper. You should put some butter in it so it sticks and it acts kind of like glue. It means that your overall cake will have, like a smooth kind of outer sides instead of being all kind of wobbly and kind of wrinkly. And when you're lining a Swiss roll tin, you should put, get greaseproof paper, lie it down flat, draw around it with a pencil. And then you're going to make sure that you have, extras that goes out over the edges, and you're going to be able to cut each edge right down the side, just not all the way in, but about, I say, a centimetre in. And this creates like your corners. Again, you're putting a bit of butter on the inside of the tin so it sticks to it, and it means you're going to have your smooth edges, and it just looks a lot more professional. This is something that you can do during your preparation time, so the 30 minutes during the cooking skills exam. Now, this is not to say that this can't as well be asked during an actual written exam, but would be particularly important for a cooking exam and for general life and just baking at home. In general, if you're able to visualize it, you're going to be able to explain it. So lining a sandwich tin. So what you get is you get a piece of greaseproof paper, just a small bit. Don't cut it out in the center, cut it out from the side so you're not wasting and you're being sustainable. So that would be a key factor then for sustainability within the cooking skills exam. Put a bit of fat in it. So in this case, it could be butter or margarine. You're going to get your tin and you're going to put the butter all around it. So you're creating like your layer, like your, say like your Pritt stick. Put it all the way around. Then what you're going to do is, again, you're going to cut out the circle, and you can see there you're not putting the tin right in the center, you put it to the side. It's just like when you were making your craft for your CBA 1 and 2nd year. You're not wasting a huge amount of fabric or paper. We're always looking for sustainability, and examiners do look for these type of things. So this would be just as important as not throwing half an onion in the bin during your cooking exams. See the way the pencil, you might have to go a bit harder around it so you can see it easier. Then what you're going to do is cut it out, and because you've put the butter at the bottom of the tin, this is now going to slot in nicely, okay? So that will be an easier way of doing it. So you can do it this way, or you can potentially do it this way. Neither of them are wrong, and you're not going to lose any marks. It's, whatever suits you best would be the best way forward. And then you could keep the extra little bits of greaseproof paper, so that next time you're making a cake, you have these little, scraps on the left, so that you're not wasting stuff. And then once you've finished with the cake and you've peeled off the greaseproof paper very gently, that can't be recycled, so it'll have to be put in the general waste disposal bin. So preparing a sandwich tin, so there are approximately 5 steps, okay? So essentially this is a written bit of what the visual was. Grease the tin with butter or margarine. It can also be done with oil or, like the spray fry light. You can put greaseproof paper under the tin, trace around the tin using pencil, not pen, cut out the circle, insert the circle of greaseproof paper into the tin, and then voila, you have that done. And if you can visualize it, you'll be well able to do it then. So preparing a big cake tin. So we have big cakes in, for example, here we have them in 12 steps. So these would be like your bigger ones for, like, say, a big, like a birthday cake, or, fruit cakes that you'd have for Christmas Day. So you get your baking tin, scissors, pencil, and greaseproof paper. You measure a strip 2 centimeters higher than the height of the tin using greaseproof paper. So you use a ruler or use, for example, a measuring tape. Mark the strip with a pencil and cut the strip out. Ensure the strip is long enough to go around the whole tin. You may need two. More than likely you're going to need two unless you have catering standard greaseproof paper, which is going to be generally a lot longer. Make cuts about 2.5 centimeters apart at the bottom of your strips. Now, it doesn't have to be necessarily 2.5 centimeters. An examiner is not going to be measuring it out. You can go roughly. Most people just go at it basically by, the naked eye, by looking at it. Press the strip and spiky bits to the bottom of the tin. Draw a circle around the base of the tin onto the greaseproof paper, and then cut it out the circle with scissors. Lightly grease the whole tin with butter, margarine, oil, whatever kind of fat you have. And this allows the greaseproof paper to stick to the tin, which means you're not getting your wobbly bits. So your cake has a perfectly sphere. Place the circle into the bottom of the tin, and then you have it ready to go. Okay, so that would be how to prepare the big tins. It's pretty much the same. Preparing bun tins and flat tins, super easy. You're going to use your cupcake cases, bun cases, muffin cases. Flat tins, you're essentially going to cut out the greaseproof paper to the same length. You're going to put a bit of oil or butter underneath so it sticks, and you're going to trim it to size. Don't have it coming out all over the place, because I have seen it catch fire in a school setting, which you don't want to happen in a practical skills exam. Testing a cake or bread for doneness. So this is not only important for the written exam and the cooking exam, but a general life skill. So there are 3 S's when we're testing a cake for doneness. So the first S is for shrivel. Take a look at the sides of the sponge or the wrinkles. If you look at that picture on the right, you'll see the little wrinkles, okay? Has it come away from the side slightly? S is for springy. When you press the sponge, does it readily spring back? If it doesn't, your finger is going to sink in. Not recommending that you put your finger in, but you can do this with a skewer. If you don't have a skewer, you can use a knife, or you can stab it with, for example, a fork or a toothpick. However, if you're using a knife or a fork, there are going to be more holes in it. It's going to affect the overall presentation. S is for spongy. Your cake should be golden, light, and brown sponge colour. So this is how you would tell if it's done before, if you can't remember how long it's been in the oven for, or something like that, okay? In the stress of exams, it can happen that people forget to set a timer. This is how you would know, other than based on time. So these would be key factors when you're making a cake for your CBA 2, for task 2 of the 2023 exams, and also for the cooking exams. If your cake is smooth all over, shrinks when you touch it, or is still very pale, it needs more time in the oven. Now, this doesn't mean it needs an extra 20 minutes. It could only need 2, 4, 5 minutes. The key to the sponge making is patience. It's a bit like pancakes. If you keep trying to go at it and prodding it, it's not going to work. Do not keep opening the oven. It will shrink with the cold air. Bend down and look through the window. If you are still unsure, poke it right in the center with a skewer. The reason why you're doing it in the center, not the sides, is because at the sides it's closer to the tin. The tin then is going to, via conduction, the heat is going to travel inwards. So the outside of the cake is going to cook faster than the inside. So if the inside is cooked, the whole thing is cooked. So if it comes out clean and it's dry, now I mean completely clean and dry, then your cake is done. Pull it out of the oven, put it on a wire rack, turn off the oven so you're not wasting electricity. So your 3 S's are shrivel, springy, and spongy. So if you can't remember how long you put it in for, that will be a visual way, and it links in with your key factors as well. So listing methods of making breads and cakes. So this would be the state part of your state explaining examples. So the SEE technique. So first up, we have our rubbing in method. If you see the picture to the top left. Next up, we have our creaming method, and you can see the video there of it occurring there. And we have the all-in-one method, which is the bottom left picture. Next up, we have the bottom right picture, which is the whisking method, which is different than the all-in-one method. And then we have finally our melting method there, and we're going to explain these in more detail, but if you can visualize or remember a recipe that you did in school, you'll be able to explain this with no problem at all. So, for example, name of method is the rubbing in method. So this is when you have fat rubbed into flour. So, for example, when you have butter and flour and you rub it together using the tips of your fingers, so essentially you're squishing the flour and the butter in together. It's the top left picture here. If your hands are really hot, it's going to melt the butter and it's going to make it really hard to do. So if you're a person with hot hands, you need to run your hands under the cold water first so that it works out best. Examples would be scones and pastry, and scones would be, one of those ones that everyone makes in home ec. Your second method, so the state is creaming method. How it's done is the explain and the example for E, so the SEE part. So creaming method is when you mix fat and sugar. So they're equal amounts. So you would have 50 grams of caster sugar to 50 grams of butter. Essentially, with the back of a spoon, you can mix it together. Or if you see the second picture on the left that's moving, you can get a handheld mixer and mix it together, and it'll come together and it will look golden, yellow, and it'll be nice and fluffy. And this is what you'd use to make your queen cakes and your Madeira cakes, and it's very commonly used in Ireland. Your all-in-one method is a really, really easy method, okay? Essentially, you get everything: eggs, flour, sugar, cocoa powder, whatever you have, and you mix it all together at once. It's the easiest and quickest method. It's very suited to beginner bakers or for when you're baking with kids. This would be for queen cakes, cakes and bread. It's often used in, say, for example, the Betty Crocker mixes. It is this picture down the bottom left there, so you can see everything goes in at once. It's really easy and fast. Your fourth method is the whisking method. So this is when you have eggs whisked under really high speed. So if you have a look there to the bottom right, the eggs, you put them in, and do you know what eggs look like? Then because air is being introduced, they start to, basically the mixture will double in size and look pale and fluffy, and there'll be loads of little bubbles there. And that's essentially what you want. It's used for like your meringues and your sponge cake. Your melting method is when you get fat and sugar and you melt it together, usually on a hob, and you allow it to cool to room temperature before eggs are added. So this would be particularly used for gingerbread men. So if you see there the bottom middle picture, and it's for ginger cake, gingerbread, oatmeal biscuits, brownies, and chocolate cake as well. But particularly the one we'd probably know for would be your gingerbread man. So here's a sample paper here. It gives you the names. So it says melting method, creaming method, rubbing in, whisking. Why I want to show this particular example is because if you wrote anything else, so if you said whisking method, if you said, say, aeration instead of whisking method, while it is technically correct, you're going to get 0 marks because it's not one of the words which is listed above. So the first one for sponge cake is whisking method, 2 is creaming, 3 for scones is rubbing in, and the gingerbread would be the melting method. So that would be an 8 marker, 2 by 4. But again, if you don't write down a method that's not listed above, you're getting 0 marks. So that's really important to actually read the question and highlight the key bits. And I'd be ticking off the bits or crossing them off as you write them. So once I've written down whisking, I cross it off at the top so I know that I'm not repeating it twice. So commercial baking mixes, if you have a look there at those pictures, you can see that there's like Betty Crocker, there's Odlums, there's so many different brands coming out. Usually we'd see like cooking mixes, could be loads of different like cakes, and many people would use them for birthday cakes. They'd have ones for like scones as well as bread. At Pancake Tuesday week, they have a lot of the commercial ones for pancakes as well. So commercial baking mixes, advantages: they're super easy to use. You don't have to weigh out anything usually. Super quick, saves time and work because you're not trying to go around the shop looking for all different types of ingredients and you're not having to weigh everything out. Disadvantages: expensive. So they're really expensive at the moment. You have to actually shop around. Especially the more healthier ones are going to be really, really expensive, and any like gluten-free options. Contain additives. So there's a reason why when you make these cakes and you leave them sitting out, that after a week they're still just as soft. It's because there's a lot of E numbers in them. There are high levels of sugar and salt in them, which is not good for obesity. So here, for example, is a question. So it says part 2 there. There's been an increase in commercial baking mixes on the market. Describe one advantage and one disadvantage of using commercial baking mixes. So you could, for example, say advantage. They are really easy to use, and don't just say really easy to use, you need to be able to give a why. So they're really easy to use because everything is there in one place. All the ingredients are provided and weighed out. Disadvantage: they can contain a lot of additives. So for example, lots of sugar to make them taste nicer and last longer, which leads to obesity. But you'll see the top question there that says list 3 guidelines to follow when making scones. Whilst that isn't actually something that is in, say, the home baking chapter, it is something that would be linked into everyone should make scones in school, so it's tying in. So for example, you would say, when I am doing the rubbing in method, I make sure that I mix the flour and butter together and make sure that my hands are nice and cold. I would make sure that when I'm making scones, I don't put too much liquid in at once, because I want to create a well in the center of the dough. I want to be able to knead the dough properly. I don't want to over roll it. I want to make sure that the scones are thick enough. So you have to think about that type of thing. So it's linking back to, when you're preparing for a culinary skills exam. So it just shows that sometimes the questions can be a bit out of the box and you just have to adapt. So in today's YouTube Live, we have looked at home baking and we've divided into 3 key parts. We've also looked at associated exam questions. We've learned that this chapter really links in with both the written exam and the practical culinary skills exam, but also to our CBA too. So you should check out the ExamRevision website. So we have lots of subjects, including Junior Cycle Home Ec. When you buy it and click into it, we have access to all video tutorials, all PowerPoint presentations, quizzes that are self-correcting, which is really, really handy. And then there's the exam builder question with past exam questions. If you were to click into the home ec one, there's 3 key strands according to the specification. So for example, we have strand 1, we have strand 2 and strand 3. So this particular chapter would have come from food, health and culinary skills. So if you were to click into it, say there's one here for obesity and dental disease, you have access to essentially me teaching the PowerPoint, so teaching the chapter. You can watch that as many times as you want. You have self-correcting quizzes. You have the PowerPoints. You can use that yourself to take down notes, and you can build exams based on past questions. So thank you for coming today and listening to this week's YouTube Live with Amy Cowan on Junior Cycle Home Economics. Make sure to check us out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course our YouTube. So we upload YouTube videos weekly for all our different subjects. Make sure to check them out. There'll be loads coming through, and there are loads of past ones as well, which are free and available to watch. So thank you for coming to today's Home Baking Junior Cycle Home Economics.